scripturally, you can't start talking till the bell rings. So now we can start. So it's good to see you tonight. Hope everybody's having a good week. Appreciate you being out this evening. We are in 1 Timothy 3. We'll hopefully finish this chapter up this evening and maybe get a little bit into chapter 4. So that's at least my game plan. Some folks to remember as we go through the evening. Dennis Thomas having shoulder surgery, maybe surgery. They're scoping his shoulder to check some things. Don't know the extent of the damage and what all they'll have to do yet. So that's tomorrow morning, so remember him. And Rhonda Ellis has been feeling really bad. Went to the ER night before last and got some meds. And so please remember Rhonda, in addition to those that we generally keep in our prayers. So let's bow and start with a word of prayer, if you would. Our great God, we are mindful of your blessings. We are reminded of your kindness in so many ways. We are appreciative of the pretty weather we've been enjoying and the beauty of your creation as the seasons change. And we recognize, Father, that these things declare your glory, but they make our life so much more pleasant, and we are grateful that you think of us the way that you do, and that you've designed the world in such a way that we can enjoy such things. We pray that we might be thankful for the little things in life that bring us joy, as well as grateful for the sobering truth of your sacrifice for us. Help us that we might bring honor to you as we live our lives and as we study together tonight. May we hold your word in great reverence. May we study with a view towards application. We ask for clear minds. We ask that you would help us to have a good understanding and help us to do what we can to spread the truth of the gospel in the world around us. We have several that we've just mentioned who are especially on our minds this evening, and we ask your blessings on them, especially as they undergo surgery and as they recover from illnesses. Help us that we might bring honor to you in everything that we do. Be with all those who are teaching and all those who are students in our classes, that we might take advantage of the opportunity before us. Please forgive our sins. In Christ we pray. Amen. Okay, 1 Timothy 3. We left off right in the middle of this section where Paul is offering to Timothy, again, these qualifications, the way we usually describe it, these characteristics that are to describe those that are to serve as overseers in every congregation, specifically for Paul's purposes and Timothy's purposes while Timothy is in Ephesus. I would remind you again, they already have overseers in Ephesus. Timothy, it almost certainly, at least in my mind, almost certainly, that doesn't make it certain, but that's the way I think of it, has some measure of God's gift to teach the gospel, to teach the Word of God. And so keep in mind that this list is not just for Timothy, but to, again, offer some authority behind Timothy's work. He's a young man doing a very difficult job, but also for our purposes, so that as we go through these processes, we can have God's will about the kind of men that are to be serving us in the position of overseer. We left off Sunday morning in verses 4 and 5, and I want to make an observation or two about these two verses. There's probably two very controversial subjects that have to do with overseers. The first we've already addressed to some measure, and that is the idea of the husband of one wife. The other is generally a man's relationship to his household. Paul in 1 Timothy 3 is very clear in verse 4 that the overseer is to be one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? This is a very simple offering in this particular passage, that a man must have proven himself capable of leading others spiritually, and the place where that is the job of every man is in his own home. And so there's not really anything in Timothy's, in the letter to Timothy that I think is very controversial. Even the plurality, notice that he mentions in verse 4, children plural. And there is some emphasis very often among brethren placed upon that. Whether that's intended or whether it's simply assumed, I would say, as a father and those of you who've raised children, because our children are all different, certainly the experience of dealing with different personalities in the home is a valuable asset for someone who is leading God's people. And the real question is whether or not a man has the capability of spiritually directing a spiritual family. And if he can't do that with his own kids, he's not going to be able to do that with God's people. The kind of conflict or question comes in, not in Paul's letter to Timothy, but in Paul's letter to Titus. In Titus chapter 1 and in verse 6, Paul uses the phrase having faithful children. Okay, some versions translate this believing children, and it's the same word. It can be translated either way. If a man is blameless, the husband of one wife, having faithful children, not accused of dissipation or insubordination. And more often than not, when there is some discussion about whether a man's children have to be Christians, the question comes as a result of the statement that's made here in Paul's letter to Titus. I want you to notice the similarities between Timothy and Titus in this section. What are the similarities? Paul doesn't use the word faithful writing to Timothy, but there are similarities, and they are what? Okay, submission. Somebody else back here? I'm sorry? Sobriety in regards to, I'm looking for specifically in regards to these verses. Verse 6 of Titus 1, not accused of dissipation or insubordination. 1 Timothy chapter 3, having his children in submission with all reverence. Okay? This idea of a child being subject to the authority of his father is clearly common to both passages. Would you agree with that? The thing that I find intriguing is that if you understand this to mean that they have to be Christians, faithful in the sense of faithful to the Lord, then why is it not included in Paul's letter regarding the Ephesus congregation, but it is in Paul's letter regarding the churches in and around Crete? For that reason, as much as anything else, I'm of the opinion that what he is describing is faithfulness not to the Lord, but faithfulness to the leadership of the Father. Now, let me say this, however. There's a lot of judgment involved in all of these qualities that you find listed in Timothy and Titus. There are degrees. There are issues of maybe somebody's propensity, but have they developed the character that has overcome that? Okay, so you take a thing like not given to anger. That's a quality that can be adjusted to through life. And I would offer this proposition for what it's worth. I don't believe this means a man's children have to be faithful to the Lord for a man to be an elder. However, it gives me pause personally to see a man who's not convinced his own children of the need for serving the Lord, especially if they've never become Christians. It's a whole different story if they become Christians and once they become adults, they decide not to serve the Lord. But it always gives me pause to see a man who's not had that kind of impact upon his own children, that at some point, even if simply out of deference to the parents, those children embrace somewhat the faith of Jesus Christ. And so, I don't believe that the passage is addressing faithfulness to the Lord, but a man who has children that are not faithful to the Lord for me personally, is kind of a red flag. And then that raises and opens the whole can of worms of what about if you have two children, one's faithful, one's not? What about children that are faithful as long as they're under the oversight of their parents, and then they leave the home and they leave the Lord? And those are questions that really are not addressed in Timothy and Titus. I would propose to you, however, and there are people a lot smarter than me, and it's not hard to find them, that would say faithful means faithful to the Lord. I just can't see that in the context of Titus, and there's no parallel in Timothy. So if that helps you somewhat in your personal study or your personal convictions, those are the comments that I would make in regards to this idea of ruling his own house well and faithful. And the word faithful, again, sometimes believing. Bill?
You mentioned something about Paul and Ephesus.
Yes.
What
Well, Timothy is in Ephesus, okay? Titus is in Crete. And so Paul is offering to Titus essentially the same instructions that he offers to Timothy. And my question is, if the word faithful has to do with believing children, why would it be demanded in Crete but not demanded in Ephesus? Because he doesn't use that language at all in his letter to Timothy. Does that clarify? Okay. I hate to ask this, but questions or comments? Okay, ding, ding, ding. That bell is over, time's up. Those are serious questions to be considered, though, folks. And I think that when a congregation is considering men to serve, it's exceptionally important that there's enough history between the man and the congregation that you have a pretty good understanding of how the man has dealt with his family. I find it personally a little dangerous when you appoint people and you have nothing to go on with regards to their background. And I would make that comment in regards to verses 4 and 5 back in 1 Timothy 3. As he gets to verse 6, there's again some very common things. Not a novice, not a new convert. Some versions may actually translate it that way. Lest being puffed up with pride, he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. This makes perfect sense. If someone's placed in a position of leadership, there's a certain degree of respect and esteem that goes with that. And for someone who uses that as a source of pride, that is a terrible quality in an overseer. And especially for someone who's new to the faith, if they're placed in a position that they are not ready to deal with, the temptation of being puffed up becomes an issue. The teaching is quite clear. Where we have issues with in this verse is, okay, what's the same condemnation as the devil? And basically there's two big possibilities. One, that Satan in some way or another at some point was rejected among God's created beings because he became proud. Okay? But we know nothing more than that. All right? That is a possibility, and it may be that that's what he's saying. If a man becomes puffed up, he falls into the same condemnation that characterized Satan. The other possibility is that the condemnation as the devil, that the same condemnation as the devil, it can be translated condemnation by the devil or of the devil. And the idea is that Satan uses pride in a newly appointed elder who is green in the faith, that Satan uses that as a temptation. And that is a very legitimate understanding of the passage. Okay? Which of the two it is, I do not know. Okay? I think both are probably true. But that's kind of the conflict or the controversy that comes over the verse 6. And you see it again in verse 7. Moreover, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside. Anything intriguing about that statement to you? Yeah. And I want you to think about Christianity when this is being written, okay? There came a point not too long in the future after Paul writes this where Christianity basically becomes an outlawed religion in the Greco-Roman world. And for a man to have a good reputation, an honest reputation, to have the respect of people in his community, in that day and age, especially if he was known to be a follower of Jesus and was suspect by the authorities, what kind of man it has that kind of character? Now, I find it exceptionally impressive that God would demand, especially in that day. And I think this is important for us. I mean, a man that has a good reputation within the church, but a kind of a reputation outside the congregation is not qualified to serve God's people. And it is rare that I hear people talk about that much. And yet I think it's imperative, is every bit as important as measuring a man by his ability to raise his children and govern his household. How's this man seen in the community around? And once again, the danger is lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil. This may be a parallel. Pride can give him, can be a reason of temptation, and so can hypocrisy. That Satan has trapped him in that way. And so it's pretty straightforward demands through verse 7, okay? Questions or comments? Anything? Yes, sir, Sam? Well, I certainly can't answer it because I have no idea the circumstance. But let me say this. I do think this is something worth thinking about. Number one, and we mentioned this as we started the chapter, this list doesn't describe the work. This list describes the character. And there are people of stellar character that are not good leaders, who are not good at managing, if you want to kind of put it kind of sort of in terms that we're more familiar with. They're not good at shepherding others. For any number of reasons. They may be too shy to address things that need to be addressed. They may not be extroverted enough to engage people. There are a number of reasons that someone might not be a good pastor, a good shepherd. Maybe it's an age thing. You know, we probably wouldn't take a 30-year-old man who falls in all these categories. We would not consider him necessarily qualified simply because he's not older yet, even though that's a kind of a fuzzy standard. And so there are circumstances where you may have a man who falls into the circumstances of 1 Timothy 3 or Titus 1, but who aren't really qualified to do the work. And the other possibility is this. I mean, you may have more men of this character than is necessary in the congregation. You know, just because a man falls into these categories does not necessarily mean that he needs to be serving. Some of that's an issue of need within a church. So I don't know, Sam, the circumstance you're describing. I can conceive of possibilities where that might be the case, but that's just me thinking out loud. It is. It is a big responsibility. Yeah, yeah. Well, you can say that. But you probably need to go too. No, you are exactly right. in verse 1, he says, whoever desires the work desires a good work. And he uses that terminology intentionally. And so you are exactly right. It is a demanding job. And for many people, a thankless job. I will say, in my years in this congregation, I have never seen a group of people like this group who are constantly offering appreciation to their elders. But that's not the case all the time. So, yeah, there are all kinds of factors that may go into someone serving or not serving. Okay? Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Sometimes people lose sight of the fact these qualifications are not automatic.
Yeah. Yeah.
These are things that being on strata.
Yeah. Yeah.
The situation presents itself as one thing like you're talking
Yeah.
about. But it's not like, oh, I check off the list, I've got these qualifications, I should be helping.
Yeah. Yeah. You're right. In fact, I appreciate the first comment especially. Which of these qualities, those of us who are men, which of these qualities do we get to dismiss in general? These are qualities God demands of all of us. But especially for those who are serving in a very visible position, and I don't hesitate to say a position of some authority. Okay, because leadership has authority attached to it, and this is really the only position in a local congregation where God gives some measure of judgment kind of authority to a group of men. Of course, they are governed by the Word, but nonetheless, it's a very important role. When you get to verse 8, in that regard, notice the first word in verse 8. It's what? Likewise. So, these qualities that are demanded of elders are equally demanded of men who serve the congregation. That's what the word deacon means. Interestingly enough, the only places you have deacon mentioned in any kind of office type description is here and in Philippians chapter 1 and verse 1, where you have a congregation with its overseers and its deacons. But that is sufficient for us to understand that God expects this in congregations. We're never really told their work other than the same way that we know what the work of overseers is, primarily because of the description, overseer, elder, shepherd. The same is true of deacon. The word deacon literally means a servant. The same qualities basically are demanded of them. In what capacity do they serve a congregation? I would say whatever capacity that congregation needs that. In Acts chapter 6, there are men selected to deal with a circumstance where people were being neglected in the daily distribution of food when all these new Christians were in Jerusalem. We don't know that those men, in fact, I would propose that those men were not deacons in the sense that we think of, because very quickly the persecution scattered the church in Jerusalem, and if they were ever quote unquote officially deacons, that ended when the Christians were all scattered. But that this is the case in other congregations is quite clear. What might their roles involve? Helping the overseers, helping the brethren to keep up with folks that are sick. We're going to find when we get over to chapter 5 that there was a kind of maybe semi-permanent is the way to describe it, roll kept of widows that the congregation was helping to support. I would propose that it's very likely the deacons were involved in that. We see that congregations sent money to other congregations when there was some kind of a disaster need. I would think the benevolent activities of a congregation would be very much fall within the realm of what the deacons would be doing. And the same is true with regards to practical things. Where are we going to meet? When are we going to meet? How are we going to secure a place to meet? Those things were necessary for those people like they are for us. So, when we look around and go, well, how do you know what their deacons were doing? Well, what had to be done in order for the work to be done. And I think that you can probably draw pretty safe conclusions. The qualities, they have to be reverent, once again, just like the overseers, not double-tongued, in other words, we would say not speaking out both sides of their mouth. Okay, honesty, they have to not be given to much wine, just like, once again, the same quality of overseers. Not greedy for money, which raises the question whether or not they were supported. There's no indication of such, but if they were helping to deal with financial things within the congregation, their honesty must be above reproach. Holding the mystery of the faith with a pure conscience. The mystery of the faith, I think, is just a Pauline way of saying the things of the gospel that used to not have been revealed but now have been revealed. I think it's simply a way of saying that these men have to be examples of what it is to live a life dedicated to the truth, to the gospel of Jesus Christ. They can't be really good at their job while, like the elders in verse 7, while they don't have a testimony of integrity outside the congregation. Verse 10, let these first be tested. The older versions read proven, and all that means is that by the time a congregation calls upon them to do this kind of work, they've already showed themselves to be men who are worthy. And let me offer this observation. It is an observation by experience, I guess, as much as anything else. Elders should already be basically doing the work of elders before they're ever asked to serve. Now, maybe not to the same degree, but you want to find somebody that's really qualified to work. Look at somebody that just as a Christian is doing things that elders do, watching out for one another, looking in on one another, helping one another serve the Lord. Same is true in regards to deacons. There are people in every congregation that are not deacons, but they are working all the time on behalf of the congregation. Those are the kind of men that need to be in the office, in the position. And I think that's what he means by verse 10. Let them first be proved, then let them serve as deacons, once again being found blameless. You just can't find much to criticize about these guys. All right? Verse 11 is the other kind of, I don't know that controversial is the right word, maybe topic of question. The word wives in verse 11 is just as properly translated women. Given the context, I think he's probably talking about deacons' wives. But there are many, and there are a lot of really capable scholars, people that have studied the language, studied the culture, who would argue that you had women in every congregation who also served in some kind of specific function in a congregation. Some people would say deaconesses. That word's never used, although Phoebe is described as a servant in Centuria. It's not deaconess, but and I wouldn't dismiss that possibility. I mean, we have women in this congregation that are doing things all the time for other women. If this word is describing that, then what he's saying is you have within your congregation women who are serving much the same way that deacons do, though perhaps not in an official capacity, because this is never mentioned anywhere else. And if that is the case, and they are recognized as such, here's the kind of people they need to be. And it's the same description. They have to be reverent. They have to not be slanderers, and my marginal rendering is malicious gossips. If you're working in a congregation with other people, the worst thing in the world that you can be doing is helping someone while you're talking about somebody else. And he says you can't have that in the congregation. They have to be temperate, self-controlled, serious-minded is the idea, faithful in all things. I personally think it's probably talking about wives because he talks about deacons, and then he talks about wives, and then he talks about deacons again. Now I have a hard time getting past the context. But recognize that it may address women generally. Back to deacons in verse 12, husband and one wife, ruling their children in their own house as well. Same qualities that you're to find in overseers. And then verse 13, those who have served well as deacon obtain for themselves a good standing, I think probably among God's people and outside God's people, and great boldness that is in the faith. Serving God's people ought to make an impact on us in regards to the way we live our lives and the way we deal with one another. I don't think that he's saying a deacon is a stepping stone to be an elder. I think what he's saying is, if this is a work you're engaged in, you're going to become passionate about it, and it's going to show up in the way that you live your life and the way you deal with people, the things you talk about. Those kind of describe these functions within the congregation. All right, questions or comments about any of this stuff here? Okay. Verse 14 through 16 is a kind of a recap. In fact, I was reading after one guy whose work I really, really respect. And he made the observation that at the end of almost every chapter in 1 Timothy, there's a kind of a personal admonition that Paul makes to Timothy. And this may well be the case here, that this is not necessarily connected to the context as much as it is just Paul reminding Timothy of the significance of his work. So, these things I write to you, though I hope to come to you shortly. If I am delayed, I write so that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God, which is the church of God, of the living God, the pillar and ground of the truth, and without controversy. Great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifest in the flesh, justified in the spirit, seen by angels, preached among the Gentiles, believed on in the world, received up into glory. First thing we find out is that wherever Paul is when he writes this, the assumption is Macedonia, because he says back in chapter 1, I left you in Ephesus when I went to Macedonia. That doesn't mean that Paul's still in Macedonia when he writes it, but that's kind of the assumption. That Paul is planning to come back and visit Ephesus again at some point. If this is after his Roman imprisonment that you find described in Acts and towards the end of his life, then that stands to reason. We just don't know for sure the timeline. He tells Titus, and most people think that this letter and Titus were written close to the same time, or at least the second letter to Timothy and Titus were written at close to the same time. He tells Titus that he wants him to come and meet him at Nicopolis, where Paul is planning to spend the winter. We really don't know if Paul ever got to do that, if Titus met him, if he got to come see Timothy again. But his point is, I'm writing these things, though I'm hoping to come and deal with some of this on my own, but if I don't make it, I write so that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God. And I mentioned this, I think, in a lesson a couple of weeks ago. I'm not sure that what he's saying is you need to know how to behave yourself among God's people. I think what he's saying is, as an evangelist, and the work that I am emphasizing to you, I'm writing these things so that you know what you're supposed to be doing among these brethren. And if you go back, what has he done in chapter 1? Well, he's warned them about false teaching, and he tells Timothy what the law is really good for and how he's supposed to be watching and the things that he's supposed to be addressing. In chapter 2, he makes some general admonitions about men and women who are Christians in general. In chapter 3, he's talked about specific functions within the congregation. So Timothy is supposed to be making sure all these things are happening. Okay? And I think that's what he's saying. I'm writing these so you know how to conduct yourself among God's people, the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and ground of the truth. Okay? One other comment that I would make about verse 15 that I find very intriguing is that Paul says to Timothy, the church is what holds up the truth. The pillar is exactly the translation that you would think. What does a pillar do? Okay, it supports like a roof or a porch of some kind. Okay, and then ground is the word foundation. So what you have is a description of a building, or maybe a temple, where you have the foundation and then you have the pillars. Now the pillars can also be somewhat ornamental, but they stand under whatever is being held up. And what he says is the church, God's people, are what hold up the truth. And I read that and I want to go, wait a minute, that's backwards, because God's people are built upon the truth, and that is true. But I think his point is, if we're going to show the world what Christianity is all about, what this mystery of faith is, that the deacons are supposed to be holding and that Timothy is supposed to be showing, it's going to come because God's people show the world truth. And here's a real practical application for us all. Is that what we're doing in our lives? Do people see the truth of the gospel because they know me? Because they know you? Or do we just kind of roll along and show up at services and try to avoid the big bad sins, and that's about the extent of it? Because this is a fascinating statement to me, and it places great responsibility upon all of us, both collectively, when people come visit here, when people get to know this church. What they need to be impressed with is not just how friendly we are, but the fact that we are practicing and promoting truth. And that's what they need to know when they see me and you individually. And that's sobering. It's sobering to me, anyway. And it should be sobering to you. I think when you get to verse 16, Paul just kind of elaborates somewhat on what the truth is. And this is probably a psalm that they sang, a hymn that they would have sung in worship that Paul's quoting from. There's a lot of Greek poetic devices here. I don't understand Greek poetry, Hebrew poetry well enough to go through them all. There's parallelism between flesh and spirit, between angels and the world, between glory and flesh. And so if we were going to look at this and take poetry of the day and kind of go, okay, let's analyze this from a poet's view, you'd be impressed. Okay? I know that because I've read several things where people have done that. I just don't follow it very well, because if it doesn't rhyme, then I'm not very good with poetry. Okay? Roses are red, violets are blue. And so my sister has written a book, a devotional book that's based upon haiku. Are you familiar with haiku? I thought haiku was either some martial art or something that you contracted if you spent much time in Asia. But it is a form of poetry. I don't get it. Okay? And I say that because we could go through this poetically, and I'm not going to help you any. But the truths that are being expressed were probably caged this way in the form of a hymn that they sang. That seems to be the common thinking. And this mystery, these unrevealed things about godliness that Paul describes are summarized. And this is a kind of a summation of the gospel. God was made known in the flesh, John chapter 1. Jesus came in flesh in order to show us God. Justified, and there's two ways to look at this. Some people propose this to mean vindicated, that Jesus was God in the flesh, and that because of His Spirit re-entering His body and being raised again, that vindicated Him as God. The other way to look at this is that justified, used in the sense that we would use it, and it's used elsewhere in Scriptures, was declared righteous. And Jesus was declared righteous in His Spirit because of His perfection. So, which is certainly part of the gospel. Seen by angels over and over through Jesus' life. You see angels that are very much concerned with the things that are going on in His life, whether it's at His birth, at His resurrection, at His temptation, etc., etc. Preached among the Gentiles. To us, that's not such a big deal. But in that world where the Jews had completely separated themselves, and considered themselves the only ones that God would ever love enough to save. For the gospel to be declared to the Gentiles was an astounding thing. We read Ephesians 1 where Paul talks about God joining Jew and Gentile together, and we go, yeah, okay. And we don't appreciate what a significant thing that was. And that, I think Paul's noting that. Believed on in the world, that as remarkable as the gospel message is, that mankind had embraced it and then received up into glory, which is the other end of manifest in the flesh. So you have the incarnation, you have the miracles and the righteousness of Jesus, you have the witnesses, you have the pronouncement, and then you have the ascension, all described in this little song here. And basically what Paul says is how true this is, and this is the mystery that God's people uphold. Okay? And that leads us up to chapter 4 where he's going to change subjects altogether. Okay? So that's where we'll pick up on Sunday. All right? Thank you.